My sister called me a failure. At Dad's funeral, then she found out about my secret life. The words hung in the air like the lingering scent of lilies that filled the funeral home, cloying, suffocating, impossible to escape. At least Dad doesn't have to worry about you anymore. My sister Rebecca's voice was barely above a whisper, but in the momentary lull between mourners approaching our receiving line, it reached me with perfect clarity. His biggest disappointment. Can't disappoint him anymore. I kept my face carefully composed as an elderly couple from Dad's church approached, murmuring condolences I acknowledged with appropriate nods and thanks. When they moved on, I turned slightly toward my sister. "This isn't the time or place, Becca," I said quietly. Her perfect makeup couldn't quite conceal the redness around her eyes, but her expression was hard as she smoothed her expensive black dress. "When is the time, then? You barely made it here. Couldn't even bother to arrive until last night, when all the arrangements were already handled. As usual, I did everything while you did. Whatever it is you do with your life." The familiar judgment stung, despite my 37 years of building immunity to it. In Rebecca's narrative, our lives had followed their inevitable trajectories, hers upward into success, Stanford Law, prestigious firm partnership, perfect marriage to a surgeon, 2 photogenic children, and a showcase home in the right suburb. Mine downward into what she perceived as mediocrity. Dropped out of college, worked a series of going-nowhere jobs, never married, rented a modest apartment in a city 3 states away, rarely visited home. A failure, just as she'd said. Least by the metrics that mattered to my family. "I'm here now," I offered, knowing it was inadequate but unsure what else to say as another cluster of mourners approached. Dad's colleagues from his 40 years at the investment firm, where he'd risen to senior vice president. Rebecca's smile transformed instantly from contempt to gracious grief as she thanked them for coming, sharing a brief anecdote about how much their friendship had meant to our father. I stood beside her, playing my supporting role in this performance of perfect family mourning, wondering not for the first time how we could possibly have shared the same household for 18 years and emerged as such different people. The rest of the funeral passed in a blur of ritualized grief, the minister's generic eulogy that could have described almost any decent man, the processional to the cemetery, the mechanized lowering of the casket, and finally, the reception. At Rebecca's sprawling home, where I stood awkwardly in a corner, nursing a glass of white wine while relatives and family friends reminisced about a man who, despite being my father, had always felt somewhat unknowable to me. Daniel wasn't much for showing emotion, my uncle remarked to no one in particular. But he was damn proud of what he built. The firm, this family. His gaze lingered meaningfully on Rebecca, who was efficiently directing caterers while simultaneously comforting our father's elderly secretary. Backbone of steel, just like his daughter here. I sipped my wine and said nothing, used to being invisible in these family narratives. Daniel Parker's disappointment, the path not taken, the potential unfulfilled. What would these people say if they knew? The thought almost made me smile, despite the solemnity of the occasion. Planning to stay through the weekend? My mother appeared beside me, her grief elegant and controlled like everything else about her. At 70, Helen Parker remained striking, her silver hair perfectly styled, her slender figure still admirable, her composure unshakable even in widowhood. "I've got a flight tomorrow afternoon," I replied. "I need to get back." "Of course." A flicker of something, disappointment, resignation, crossed her face. "To your job." The way she said it made clear her assessment of my employment status, though she knew as little about my current work as she had about any of the positions I'd held over the years. In her mind, I was still working at the coffee shop where I'd landed after dropping out of the business program she and Dad had selected for me. "Yes, Mother. To my job." She nodded, patting my arm absently before drifting away to thank someone for a casserole or arrangement or whatever casserole-adjacent thing people were still bringing, despite the catered spread Rebecca had organized. I watched her go, wondering if she had ever once in my lifetime asked me a genuine question about my life or interests. Not what she expected me to care about, but what I actually did. I was contemplating a discreet exit when Rebecca cornered me in the hallway between the kitchen and the powder room, her smile tight and her voice low to prevent any mourners from overhearing. "Mom tells me you're leaving tomorrow." "I have work." "Commitments," I said, the explanation both true and deliberately vague. "Of course you do." Her tone made clear exactly what she thought of my work commitments. Always too busy for family. Too busy for Dad when he was alive. Too busy to stay more than 48 hours now that he's gone. "That's not fair, Becca. Isn't it? When's the last time you came home? Christmas? No, you begged off with some excuse. Thanksgiving? No. Same thing. I think it was Mom's birthday last May, and you stayed exactly one night." She wasn't wrong. I had minimized my time in my hometown for years, finding the weight of disapproval and misunderstanding too heavy to bear for extended periods. But it wasn't for the reasons she assumed. "I call regularly," I offered, knowing how weak it sounded. "I sent cards, gifts. Wow, what an effort." Rebecca's perfect smile never wavered, though her eyes were cold. "You know what Dad said to me the last time we discussed you? He said he'd given up trying to understand what went wrong. His exact words were, 'I've accepted that Jamie will never amount to anything significant.' That was his deathbed assessment of his only son. The words landed like a physical blow, though I'd heard variations on the theme throughout my adult life. I inhaled slowly, refusing to let her see how deeply they cut. "I'm sorry I was such a disappointment to him," I said finally. "And to you." "Are you?" "Because you've had 20 years to change course, to make something of yourself. Instead, you drift from job to job, living in some cramped apartment, no career, no family, nothing to show for nearly 4 decades of life." I looked at my sister, really looked at her, and saw beneath the anger a genuine bewilderment. In her worldview, the path to a worthwhile life was clearly marked. Prestigious education, lucrative career, appropriate marriage, children, property, acquisition, community standing. My rejection of that trajectory wasn't just a different choice, it was incomprehensible, a deliberate embrace of failure. "I have to get back to the guests," she said when I didn't respond, smoothing her dress. With an automatic gesture, "Some of us take our responsibilities seriously." She turned to go, then paused. "Oh, Dad's lawyer called this morning. Reading of the will is Monday at 11. I told him you wouldn't be able to attend, given your commitments. He'll send whatever paperwork is necessary to your address." "Thanks," I said, not bothering to challenge her presumption. I had indeed planned to leave the next day, and extending my stay in my hometown held no appeal, even for the formality of inheritance. Whatever Dad had left me, likely some token, amount to acknowledge my existence while giving the bulk to Rebecca, could be handled remotely. "Don't worry about Mom," Rebecca added, her tone suggesting this hadn't been a concern of mine anyway. "I'll be moving her into the guest house next month. You know, the one attached to the home I built with my successful career and stable marriage. That way she won't be alone in her grief." The barb was so expected I almost laughed. "That's generous of you, Becca. I'm sure she'll appreciate it." She gave me one last look, part pity, part disdain, before returning to her role as the perfect grieving daughter, graciously accepting condolences while efficiently managing the reception. I slipped away an hour later without formal goodbyes, returning to the modest hotel room I'd booked instead of staying at either my mother's house or Rebecca's home. Loosening my tie and collapsing onto the bland floral bedspread, I stared at the textured ceiling and replayed Rebecca's words. Dad said he'd given up trying to understand what went wrong. His exact words were, "I've accepted that Jamie will never amount to anything significant." Had he really said that? Probably. It aligned with the subtle and not-so-subtle messages I'd received throughout my life. The disappointment when I'd changed majors from business to art history. The barely concealed anger when I'd left college entirely. The strained conversations during increasingly infrequent visits home, where my vague descriptions of various jobs were met with thinly veiled dismay. What would he think if he knew the truth? My phone buzzed with a text, jolting me from painful reminiscence. The message was from Paolo. All set for Monday. Contracts finalized. Need you back for signatures and launch prep. I texted back a quick confirmation, then opened my laptop and pulled up my flight information. I could change it, stay for the will reading, endure a few more days of Rebecca's contempt and my mother's elegant disappointment. But to what end? Nothing would change their perception of me as the family failure, and I had actual responsibilities. Waiting. Responsibilities that neither Rebecca nor my mother nor my recently deceased father had ever bothered to understand. I confirmed my original flight for the following afternoon, then spent a few hours catching up on emails and project updates. When exhaustion finally overtook me, I fell asleep still wearing my funeral suit, dreaming of the life waiting for me, 3 states away, the life no one in my family had ever truly seen. The next morning, I checked out early and drove the rental car to my mother's house, intending a brief farewell visit before heading to the airport. The home where I'd grown up looked exactly as it always had, a stately colonial in an established neighborhood, impeccably maintained, nothing out of place or unexpected, like my mother herself. She answered the door in a perfectly appropriate black ensemble, her grief accessorized as tastefully as everything else in her life. "Jamie, I thought you'd be on your way to the airport by now." "My flight's not until 3. I wanted to check on you before I left." She stepped back to allow me entry, leading me to the formal living room where no one had ever actually lived. We sat in silent discomfort for a moment before she spoke. "It was a lovely service, wasn't it? Your father would have approved. Dignified." "Yes, very dignified." I searched for something meaningful to say to this woman who had given birth to me but always seemed to be waiting for me to become someone else. "How are you holding up?" "As well as can be expected." She smoothed an invisible wrinkle from her slacks. "Rebecca has been wonderful, of course. I don't know what I'd do without her." The implied comparison hung in the air between us. I let it pass. "She mentioned you'll be moving to her guest house." "Yes, next month. No sense rattling around this big house by myself, and it will be nice to be closer to the grandchildren." She glanced at me with the same faint disappointment that had colored her expression whenever she looked at me for at least 2 decades. "Rebecca says you won't be staying for the will reading. I need to get back. Work." "Of course." Again, that particular inflection that made clear her assessment of my employment. "Well, I'm sure Malcolm will forward whatever paperwork is necessary." Malcolm Reeves, Dad's attorney and golf partner. Another pillar of the community who'd watched me fail to live up to the Parker family expectations. "I'm sure he will." I stood, recognizing the familiar signs that my mother was ready for this awkward interaction to end. "I should get going. Traffic to the airport and all that." She walked me to the door, her movements as graceful at 70 as they had been throughout my childhood. At the threshold, she surprised me with a brief hug. Not affectionate exactly, but acknowledging the social requirement of the moment. "Have a safe flight, Jamie. Call when you land, so I know you arrived safely." It was the sort of thing mothers said to children, though I was 37 and had been traveling independently for nearly 2 decades. Still, I nodded. "I will. Take care of yourself, Mom." As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw her still standing in the doorway, a slender silhouette against the perfect facade of the house where I'd never quite fit. I felt the familiar mixture of relief and regret that accompanied every departure from my hometown. Relief to be escaping the weight of unmet expectations. Regret that I couldn't simply be the son they had wanted. The flight was uneventful. and by evening I was back in my apartment, the cramped living space Rebecca had dismissively referenced. In reality, it was a spacious converted loft in a renovated industrial building, with exposed brick walls, tall windows, and an open floor. Plan that housed both my living space and my workspace. I dropped my suitcase by the door and stood for a moment, inhaling the familiar sense of oil paint, turpentine, and the faint trace of coffee from the small kitchenette. Home. Not the one I'd grown up in, but the one I'd created for myself. I kicked off my shoes and padded to the large work table where 3 canvases were in various stages of completion, each one representing thousands of dollars in commissioned work. Beside them lay the mock-ups for the children's book series that had quietly made me a millionaire 5 times over. The cheerful, adventurous elephant character that graced backpacks, lunchboxes, pajamas, and bedding in households across the country, and increasingly, around the world. Elliot the Extraordinary, created during my wasted year working at the coffee shop after dropping out of college, sketched on napkins between customers and developed during quiet evening shifts. Elliot, whose first book had been rejected by 27 publishers before finding a home with a small press that had subsequently been purchased by a major publishing house specifically to acquire the rights to my increasingly popular character. Elliot, who now supported my failure of a life quite comfortably, allowing me to pursue both commercial illustration and the serious painting that had recently begun attracting attention from gallery owners in New York and Los Angeles. I changed out of my funeral suit into paint-splattered jeans and a t-shirt, poured a glass of good whiskey, and settled at my work table to reacquaint myself with the projects that had been interrupted by my father's death and funeral. In the morning, I'd head to the studio space I maintained separately from my living quarters, where Paolo and the small team that helped manage the expanding Elliot enterprise would be waiting to finalize contracts for an animated series with a major streaming service. The failure, signing a 7-figure deal for his mediocre life's work. I took a sip of whiskey and picked up a brush, losing myself in the familiar comfort of color and line and form, gradually washing away the funeral and Rebecca's contempt, and my mother's disappointment, and my father's final assessment of my worth. For a moment, I imagined telling them, showing them the best-selling books with my name on the cover, the licensing agreements, the commercial success I'd achieved on my own terms. Pictured Rebecca's disbelief, my mother's belated pride, the posthumous reversal of my father's judgment. But the fantasy faded as quickly as it had formed. The truth was, I'd kept my success private not out of shame or secretiveness, but because I'd realized years ago that no achievement would ever be quite right in their eyes. The goalposts would always move. Sure, you're successful now, but why did you waste those early years? Yes, you've made money, but where's your family? Your community standing? Your proper place in the established order of things? Better to maintain the comfortable distance, the mutual misunderstanding. Better to be the family disappointment from afar than to subject my actual life and choices to their narrow assessment up close. I worked until nearly dawn, then fell into bed for a few hours of sleep before the meeting that would expand Elliot's world into yet another medium. As consciousness faded, I thought again of Rebecca's words at the funeral, the absolute certainty with which she'd pronounced me a failure. At least Dad doesn't have to worry about you anymore. His biggest disappointment can't disappoint him anymore. The irony almost made me laugh, even on the edge of sleep. If only she knew. The contracts were signed with minimal drama, Paolo's skillful negotiation having secured favorable terms before I'd even left for the funeral. The animation studio had already produced preliminary character sketches that captured Elliot's essential charm while adapting him for movement, and the writers had outlines for the first season's episodes that remained faithful to the spirit of the books. "We're looking at a holiday launch," Paolo explained as we reviewed the production timeline. "They want to capitalize on the Christmas merchandise potential." I nodded, still slightly distracted by the emotional hangover of the funeral and family. Interactions. "The character Bible looks solid. I'm glad they're keeping his core traits intact." They know better than to mess with a winning formula. Elliot's appeal is precisely his combination of adventure and gentleness. Parents love that. He models courage without aggression. We spent the next few hours fine-tuning details, after which I escaped to my studio to work on the paintings that increasingly occupied my creative energy. Large, complex canvases exploring themes of identity and perception that bore no resemblance to the cheerful elephant of my commercial success. The next few days passed in a productive rhythm of meetings, painting sessions, and routine tasks, the funeral receding into memory as I re-immersed myself in my actual life. I had just finished a particularly satisfying day of work on a commissioned illustration series when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. James Parker? The voice was professionally modulated, unfamiliar. Yes, this is Jamie. This is Malcolm Reeves, your father's attorney. I'm calling regarding Daniel Parker's estate, my father's lawyer. I glanced at the calendar. Monday. The will reading I hadn't attended. Yes, Mr. Reeves. I understand you'll be forwarding any necessary paperwork? That was the plan, he said, a strange note in his voice I couldn't quite identify. However, given the specific nature of your father's bequest and some unusual instructions he left, I believe it would be best if we could meet in person. I frowned, setting down my brush and giving the call my full attention. Unusual instructions? Yes. Without going into details that should be discussed face-to-face, your father left specific directives regarding his estate that involve you more centrally than you might have anticipated. That was unexpected. I had assumed I'd receive some token inheritance, perhaps a few family heirlooms or a modest sum, while Rebecca would be the primary beneficiary. That had always been the unspoken understanding. The successful daughter would manage the family legacy, while the disappointing son would receive the minimum required by propriety. I see. When would you need to meet? As soon as possible, ideally. There are time-sensitive matters involved. I mentally reviewed my calendar. The animation production meeting tomorrow, a gallery owner visiting my studio on Thursday, ongoing. Work on multiple projects with varying deadlines. I could fly in this weekend, I offered, already dreading another trip to my hometown so soon after the funeral. That would be acceptable. Saturday morning? Say 10 o'clock at my office? We confirmed the details and I hung up feeling unsettled. What unusual instructions could my father possibly have left regarding me? And why would they require an in-person meeting? The questions lingered as I booked another flight and hotel room, interrupting my concentration during the animation, meeting and distracting me as the gallery owner examined my recent work with obvious interest. These have a fascinating tension to them, she observed, studying a large canvas dominated by fragmented perspectives of the same subject. There's something almost confrontational in how you're exploring the disconnection between perceived identity and lived experience. That's very much the theme I'm working with, I acknowledged, momentarily pulled from thoughts of my father's mysterious bequest. How we're seen versus how we are. The gap between those perspectives. Well, I'd like to include 3 or 4 pieces in our fall showcase. It's a group exhibition focusing on emerging mid-career artists working with identity themes. Your work would fit beautifully, and it would be an excellent introduction to our collector base. The opportunity was significant, my first showing, in a respected New York gallery. But even as I discussed details and signed preliminary agreements, part of my mind remained occupied with Malcolm Reeves's cryptic call and what awaited me in my hometown that weekend. By Saturday morning, I was back in familiar territory, driving a rental car through the town where I'd grown up toward the downtown office building that housed Malcolm Reeves's law practice. The weather had turned cooler since the funeral the previous week, a hint of autumn crispness in the air that matched my slightly apprehensive mood. Reeves was waiting in a conference room, a leather portfolio and several file folders arranged precisely on the polished table before him. At 60-something, he remained as I remembered him from childhood visits to our home, silver-haired, impeccably dressed, with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to managing other people's significant affairs. "James," he greeted me, extending his hand. "Thank you for coming on such short notice." "It sounded important," I replied, settling into the chair he indicated, "though I'm still not clear on why this required an in-person meeting." "Yes, well." He opened one of the files, removing a formal-looking document. "I've been your father's attorney and friend for nearly 40 years. In that capacity, I've executed many straightforward wills and estate plans. However, Daniel's instructions regarding you are somewhat unique." I waited, curious despite myself. "Before we proceed, I should ask, has your sister or mother contacted you since the will reading on Monday?" "No." Not surprising, given our strained relationships and the brevity of my hometown visit. "Why?" Malcolm's expression was carefully neutral. "The terms of your father's will came as something of a shock to them. I thought perhaps they might have reached out, but I see they've chosen to process the information privately before making contact." Now I was genuinely intrigued. What exactly did Dad's will say that would shock them? In essence, Daniel left the bulk of his estate to you, not to Rebecca, as everyone, including your sister and mother, had assumed would be the case. I stared at him, certain I had misheard. That can't be right. Dad always, Rebecca, was always the favored child, perhaps in day-to-day family dynamics. But your father's estate planning told a different story. Malcolm slid the document across the table. "This is a copy of the will. As you can see, apart from some specific bequest to your mother providing for her continued comfort, and a modest legacy for Rebecca, the majority of Daniel's assets are directed to you." I scanned the document, struggling to process what I was seeing. Specific bequests to my mother, the house, an investment account generating income for her support, various personal items, a cash bequest to Rebecca of $100,000 and some family heirlooms, and then, astonishingly, to my son James Parker, I leave the remainder of my estate, including but not limited to my ownership interest in Parker Investments, LLC, my personal investment portfolio, and all other assets not specifically designated elsewhere in this document. "This doesn't make sense," I said finally, looking up from the paper. "Dad always made it clear that Rebecca was the responsible one, the success story. Why would he leave everything to me?" Malcolm removed another document from his portfolio. "That brings us to the unusual instructions I mentioned. Your father left this letter to be delivered to you in the event of his death, with explicit directions that it was to be given only after the will had been read and only in a private in-person meeting." He handed me a sealed envelope with my name written on it in my father's distinctive handwriting. "I'll give you some privacy to read this. Take as much time as you need." When he had left the room, closing the door softly behind him, I stared at the envelope for a long moment before carefully breaking the seal. Inside was a letter, several pages long, written in the same precise hand that had signed report cards and permission slips throughout my childhood. "Dear Jamie, if you're reading this, then I've died, and Malcolm has executed my will according to my instructions. You're likely confused by my decision to leave the bulk of my estate to you rather than to your sister. I owe you an explanation, one I should have given you years ago in person, but lacked the courage to deliver. The simple truth is this: I've known about your success for years. The children's books, the licensing empire, the commercial illustration work, even the more serious painting you've pursued more recently. I've known, watched from a distance, and said nothing, a silence that requires explanation and, I hope, forgiveness. It began about 7 years ago. I was in New York for a financial conference and had a free afternoon. I decided to visit a bookstore, something I rarely made time for at home. While browsing, I came across a display of children's books featuring a character called Elliot the Extraordinary, an elephant whose adventures were capturing children's imaginations across the country. I picked up one of the books, attracted by the charming illustrations, and was stunned to see your name on the cover. At first, I thought, it must be a coincidence, another James Parker. But the author biography confirmed it was indeed you, with a photo that, while professional and somewhat stylized, was unmistakably my son. My first reaction, I'm ashamed to say, was disbelief followed quickly by anger. Here you were, successfully published, while letting your family believe you were struggling in a series of dead-end jobs. It felt like deliberate deception, almost mockery of our concern. I purchased the book, but told no one what I'd discovered. Over the following weeks, I researched your work online, gradually uncovering the extent of your success. The multiple best-selling books, the merchandising deals, the growing reputation in illustration circles. I even found financial analysts' discussions of the privately held company that managed your character's licensing, estimating its value in the millions. All while we, your mother, your sister, and I, continued to believe you were barely making ends meet, unable or unwilling to find a proper career path. I considered confronting you, demanding an explanation for the deception. But the more I reflected, the more uncomfortable questions arose. Not about your choices, but about mine. Why hadn't you shared this success with your family? What in our relationship had made you believe we wouldn't celebrate this achievement? What had I done or failed to do that made you keep such a significant part of your life hidden from us? These questions led to painful self-examination. I began to recognize how narrowly I had defined success: prestigious degrees, conventional career paths, traditional family structures. I saw for the first time how my disappointment when you left college wasn't concern for your welfare as I'd told myself, but embarrassment about what others would think. I realized how little interest I had shown in your actual passions and talents, how quick I had been to judge your choices by metrics that mattered to me rather than to you. In short, I began to understand why you might have kept your success private. I had made it clear that only certain types of achievement counted as legitimate in our family. Your creative path didn't fit those parameters, so you stopped sharing it with us rather than continually subjecting your choices to our judgment. Once I recognized this difficult truth, I faced a choice. I could reveal that I knew about your success, potentially opening a conversation that might heal our relationship. Or I could remain silent. Cowardice won out. I told myself I was respecting your privacy, but in truth, I was avoiding the uncomfortable reckoning with my own failures as a father that such a conversation would require. Instead, I began quietly following your career, purchasing each new book as it was published, reading industry news about licensing deals, even visiting a gallery in Chicago where some of your more serious work was displayed in a group show. I became a secret witness to the success you never discussed during your increasingly infrequent visits home or our brief phone conversations. I also began restructuring my estate plan. If I couldn't find the courage to acknowledge your achievement, in life, I could at least recognize it in death. The respect and admiration I couldn't express to your face, I could demonstrate through my final wishes. The bulk of my estate going to you, rather than Rebecca, isn't about favoring one child over another. It's an acknowledgement that your sister has already established financial security through her own excellent career, while you have built something remarkable entirely without my support or encouragement. I don't expect this posthumous recognition to make up for decades of misunderstanding and judgment, but I hope it might serve as a belated acknowledgement that I did eventually see you. The real you, not the version of yourself we pressured you to become. I hope it might open a door to a more honest relationship between you and your mother and sister, though I recognize that door may have long since closed. I am proud of you, Jamie. Not because of your commercial success or financial achievement, but because you had the courage to follow your own path, despite our lack of support. You built a life on your own terms, pursuing work that matters to you, creating things that bring joy to countless children, and, more recently, exploring deeper artistic expression that challenges and moves viewers. That took more backbone than following the conventional path your sister and I chose. It took integrity and vision I didn't recognize until it was too late to tell you in person. For that failure, perhaps my greatest, I can only offer this belated apology and the hope that you might forgive what I didn't understand in time. With love and long overdue admiration. Dad. I set the letter down, my vision blurred with unexpected tears. For several minutes, I simply sat there, overwhelmed by the revelation that my father had known about my success for years, had privately followed my career while maintaining the fiction of disappointment, had struggled with his own failure to understand my choices until it was too late for reconciliation. A soft knock at the door roused me from this stunned reflection. Malcolm Reeves entered, his expression softening slightly when he saw my evident emotion. I take it the letter provided some context for your father's decisions? I nodded, not quite trusting my voice yet. I should note that I was not privy to the contents of that letter, Malcolm continued, resuming his seat across from me. Daniel was quite specific that it was for your eyes only. However, he did share with me the general outlines of why he had restructured his estate plan, and he asked me to answer any questions you might have about the practical implications of your inheritance. I cleared my throat, trying to regain my composure. How much are we talking about exactly? The will mentions his ownership interest in Parker Investments and his personal portfolio, but I don't have any sense of what that actually means in financial terms. The total value of your inheritance, excluding the provisions for your mother's support, is approximately $23 million. I stared at him, unable to fully process the figure. $23 million. From a father who had died believing I was barely scraping by, never knowing that I had already built my own financial security. That's substantial. Indeed. Daniel was an excellent investor, both for his clients and for himself. Parker Investments has become one of the most respected private wealth management firms in the region, and your father maintained a controlling interest until his death. That interest now transfers to you, though day-to-day operations are handled by the executive team he put in place. The irony was almost too perfect. My father had left me a significant ownership stake in a wealth management firm, never knowing that I'd already been quietly managing my own substantial fortune for years through careful investment of my Elliott earnings. And Rebecca and my mother? You mentioned they were shocked at the will reading. Malcolm's professional composure slipped slightly, revealing a hint of discomfort. That would be an understatement. Your sister was vocal in her surprise and displeasure. Your mother was more restrained, but clearly taken aback. They had both assumed Rebecca would be the primary beneficiary, with perhaps some small provision for you. I'm sure they had questions about Dad's reasoning. Many questions, yes, which I was unable to answer fully, given that Daniel had shared his complete reasoning only in that letter. I explained that he had revised his estate plan several years, ago after significant consideration, and that he had left instructions that could not be disclosed beyond the contents of the will itself. I thought about Rebecca's cruel words at the funeral, her absolute certainty that I was the family disappointment, the failure who had never amounted to anything significant. Now she was grappling with the revelation that our father had chosen to leave his substantial fortune primarily to me, with only a token bequest to her. The shock must have been considerable. I'm surprised they haven't contacted me, I mused. Though in truth, I wasn't. Both Rebecca and my mother would need time to process this upending of their assumptions, to construct narratives that preserved their understanding of family dynamics, despite this contradictory evidence. They may be awaiting your initiative, Malcolm suggested. The will reading was only 5 days ago, after all, and given the tension that has apparently existed around your life choices, they may be uncertain how to approach you in light of Daniel's decisions. I nodded, folding my father's letter carefully and returning it to its envelope. What happens next? Practically speaking, I mean. There is paperwork to sign today, transferring ownership interests and account control. After that, the management team at Parker Investments will need to meet with you to discuss your wishes regarding your involvement, whether you want active participation in firm decisions or prefer a more hands-off approach as an owner. The personal investment portfolio can be transferred to your existing financial advisors, or we can maintain it through the current management structure. He outlined several other procedural matters, all of which seemed surreal in light of the emotional revelation contained in my father's letter. I signed where indicated, provided necessary information, and answered practical questions, operating on autopilot while my mind struggled to integrate this new understanding of my father, a man who had recognized his failures of understanding. Too late to address them in life, attempting instead to acknowledge them through his final wishes. As Malcolm walked me out after nearly 2 hours of paperwork and explanations, he paused at the building entrance. Your father and I were friends for many years, James. In that capacity, rather than as his attorney, may I share an observation? Of course. Daniel changed in recent years, became more reflective, less rigid in his judgments. He spoke of you differently, still with a certain sadness about your distance from the family, but also with what I now recognize was private pride he couldn't express openly without revealing what he knew. I believe he truly regretted the misunderstanding that grew between you, even if he couldn't find the words to bridge it while he was alive. I nodded, throat tight with emotion I couldn't quite express. Thank you for telling me that. As I drove away from Malcolm's office, my father's letter burned like a physical presence in my pocket. I found myself heading not toward my hotel, but in the direction of Rebecca's neighborhood, the exclusive enclave where her showcase home stood as testament to her successful adherence to the family vision of achievement. I hadn't planned this visit. I had no prepared speech, no strategy for navigating the inevitable confrontation with my sister, but something in my father's posthumous confession had awakened an unfamiliar impulse, not to gloat or retaliate for years of dismissal, but to attempt what he had been unable to, an honest conversation that might bridge the chasm of misunderstanding between us. Rebecca's house was exactly what you'd expect from a successful corporate attorney with carefully cultivated social standing. A sprawling colonial revival on a manicured acre, tastefully updated while maintaining appropriate traditional elements. The kind of home featured in regional magazines, simultaneously impressive and anonymous in its perfection. I sat in the rental car for several minutes, questioning the wisdom of an unannounced visit. Rebecca and I had rarely managed civil conversation, even in the structured environment of family gatherings. What made me think we could navigate this emotional minefield without a mediator? Before I could reconsider, the front door opened and Rebecca herself emerged, dressed in expensive athleisure wear, clearly heading out for a run. She stopped abruptly when she spotted my unfamiliar car in the driveway, shielding her eyes against the morning sun as she tried to identify the unexpected visitor. Moment of truth. I took a deep breath and stepped out of the car. Jamie? Her voice carried across the driveway, surprise momentarily displacing her usual controlled tone. What are you doing here? I just came from Malcolm Reeves's office, I said, approaching slowly, giving her time to process my unexpected appearance. I thought we should talk. A complex series of emotions crossed her face: confusion, anger, something that might have been embarrassment, before settling into the composed expression she wore like armor. I suppose we should, though I wish you'd called first. It was a spontaneous decision. She glanced at her fitness watch, then back at me. Give me a minute to change. You might as well come inside instead of standing in the driveway for the neighbors to speculate about. I followed her into the house, taking in the immaculate interior that looked like a high-end design magazine come to life. Neutral palette, carefully chosen statement pieces, family photos arranged to suggest warmth, without disrupting the overall aesthetic. Rebecca gestured toward the kitchen. "Help yourself to coffee. I'll be down in a few minutes." Left alone, I wandered through the open-concept main floor, noting the evidence of Rebecca's picture-perfect life. Framed diplomas and professional awards, photos of her surgeon husband receiving some medical honor, their two photogenic children, in coordinating outfits at various milestone events. A life meticulously curated to demonstrate success by every conventional metric our parents had valued. The kitchen continued the theme of controlled perfection: high-end appliances, marble countertops, a professional-grade espresso machine that looked barely used. I opted for water instead of coffee, too restless to operate unfamiliar equipment, and was standing by the large windows overlooking the backyard when Rebecca returned in a silk blouse and tailored pants, her runner's outfit replaced by something more appropriate for serious conversation. "So," she said without preamble, "Dad left you everything. I assume Malcolm explained the details?" "Not everything," I corrected. "Mom's well provided for, and you received a bequest too. $100,000 in grandmother's jewelry," she said flatly. "Compared to what, 20 million? More?" Malcolm was circumspect about the total value, but I was able to estimate based on what I already knew about Dad's holdings. 23 million, apparently. She made a small sound. Not quite a laugh. Something harder. 23 million. To the son who never visited, who rejected everything Dad valued, who drifted through life without direction or achievement. Can you understand why I might find that difficult to accept? Here it was, the fundamental disconnect that had shaped our relationship for decades. In Rebecca's narrative, I was the family failure, the disappointing son who had rejected our father's values and squandered my potential. And from her limited perspective, with the information she'd been allowed to have, that assessment made perfect sense. "It's not what you think," I said carefully. "Dad left me a letter explaining his decision. He had reasons you're not aware of." What possible reason could justify cutting out the child who actually built a successful life? Who was there for family holidays and birthdays? Who visited regularly and called weekly? Who'll be taking care of Mom now? The controlled facade was cracking, revealing genuine hurt beneath the anger. "What reason, Jamie?" I reached into my pocket and removed the letter. He knew about my work, had known for years. "What work?" Rebecca's confusion was genuine. "Your coffee shop jobs? Your freelance, whatever it was you mentioned last time anyone asked?" "My books, my illustration career, the licensing company. All of it." She stared at me, clearly not comprehending. "What books? What are you talking about?" It struck me then that she truly had no idea, that the professional success I'd achieved had remained completely unknown to my sister, despite her confident assessment of my life as a failure. The realization was both liberating and profoundly sad. We had existed in parallel universes, each with a narrative about the other that bore little resemblance to reality. "I'm a children's book author and illustrator," I explained, the words feeling strange to speak aloud in my childhood home, to the sister who had never known this fundamental aspect of my identity. "I created a character called Elliot the Extraordinary. About 15 years ago. The books became bestsellers. There's merchandise, a licensing company, now an animated series in development." Rebecca's expression suggested she was waiting for a punchline. "You're not serious." "I am. And apparently Dad discovered one of my books in New York years ago. He followed my career secretly ever since, never letting on that he knew, but restructuring his will to acknowledge what I'd built independently." "This is absurd," Rebecca said, but uncertainty had crept into her voice. "If you've been some successful children's author all this time, why would you keep it secret? Why let everyone think you were struggling in menial jobs?" It was a fair question, one my father had grappled with in his letter. Because by the time the first book found success, The pattern was already established. You and Mom and Dad had made it clear that only certain types of achievement counted as legitimate: prestigious degrees, conventional careers, traditional life milestones. My path didn't fit those parameters, so I stopped sharing it rather than continually subjecting my choices to familiar judgment. "That's not," Rebecca began, then stopped, a flicker of uncomfortable recognition crossing her face. "We never said your choices weren't legitimate. Didn't you? When are you going to get a real job, Jamie? Still making coffee for a living? No career, no family, nothing to show for nearly 4 decades of life." Your exact words at Dad's funeral. She had the grace to look embarrassed. I was emotional. Grief makes people say things they don't mean. Except you've been saying versions of the same thing for years. So did Dad. So did Mom. The only difference at the funeral was how explicitly you stated what's always been the family assessment of my life. Rebecca moved to the kitchen island, leaning against it as if suddenly needing physical support. "So you're saying you've been some kind of secret success story all this time? Making what exactly?" "Last year, the licensing company grossed just under $8 million. My personal income was about $3 million after taxes and business expenses." The figures felt strange to say aloud. The financial reality I'd kept private, for so many years suddenly exposed in my sister's immaculate kitchen. I've been financially independent since my early 30s. Rebecca stared at me, her expression cycling through disbelief, confusion, and the beginning stages of anger. "And you never thought to mention this? You let us worry about you, feel sorry for you, assume you were barely getting by? When was the last time you actually asked about my life, Becca? Not with assumptions already embedded in the question, but with genuine curiosity about what I was doing or creating." She opened her mouth, then closed it, clearly struggling to recall an instance that didn't exist. "The pattern was established years ago," I continued. "You were the success, I was the failure. That narrative was comfortable for everyone, including me in some ways. It kept expectations low, interactions predictable. By the time I had achieved what might count as success, even by family standards, it seemed easier to maintain the established dynamic than to challenge it. So instead, you lied, for years, to all of us." I omitted, I deflected, I redirected, but I never actually lied about my work. No one ever directly asked, "Jamie, are you a successful children's book author with a licensing empire?" So I never had to deny it. A hint of the old Rebecca emerged, the sharp lawyer who could cut through emotional complexity to the factual heart of a matter. "And now Dad has left you a fortune to add to the fortune you apparently already have, while I get what amounts to a token acknowledgement. Can you understand why that might seem unjust from my perspective?" "Completely," I acknowledged. "Based on what you knew, it makes no sense at all. I'm not here to defend Dad's decision or to gloat about the inheritance. I'm here because his letter made me realize that decades of mutual misunderstanding have cost us something neither of us recognized we were losing. The possibility of an adult relationship based on who we actually are, not who we've assumed each other to be." Rebecca studied me for a long moment, the anger gradually shifting to something more complex. Not quite acceptance, but perhaps the beginning of reassessment. "I need to see this letter." I hesitated. The letter was intensely personal, my father's private confession and apology. But it also contained his perspective on our family dynamics, insights Rebecca might need to understand his decisions and my long silence. "Some parts are very personal," I said, holding out the envelope. "But you can read it. It might help explain things I'm struggling to articulate." She took the letter and moved to the kitchen table, sitting down to read while I remained standing by the windows, watching her expression change as she absorbed our father's posthumous revelation. When she finally looked up, her eyes were bright, with unshed tears. "He knew all this time," she said softly, "and never said anything to anyone." That was his choice. One I don't fully understand, but had to accept when I read the letter. In a way, you both maintained the same fiction, Rebecca observed with surprising insight. You pretending to be less successful than you were, him pretending not to know about your actual success. A mutual deception that prevented honest conversation. I hadn't thought of it that way, but you're right. Neither of us found a way to bridge the gap while he was alive. She folded the letter carefully, returning it to the envelope with the precision that characterized everything she did. And what about now? Are you going to continue the fiction with Mom? With me? It was a fair question, one I hadn't fully resolved in my own mind. The protective barrier of assumed failure had served me well in many ways, keeping family expectations and judgments at a manageable distance. But my father's letter had made clear the cost of that protection. Relationships built on fundamental misunderstandings, connections that could never deepen because they weren't grounded in truth. I don't want to continue the fiction, I said, finally. But I'm not sure what replaces it. We've operated with certain assumptions about each other for so long. I don't know if we can establish something different at this point. Rebecca considered this, her analytical mind visibly working through the implications. Did you bring any of your books? The ones Dad discovered? The question surprised me. No, I didn't think to. She reached for her phone, tapping quickly. What was the character called again? Elliot something? Elliot the Extraordinary. A few more taps, then her eyebrows rose as she scrolled through what was evidently search results. There are 15 books, and a merchandise line, and... She looked up, genuinely startled. Is that your signature on the school backpack, Claire? Got for her birthday last year? The elephant one she insisted on because all her friends had them? Probably. The backpacks are bestsellers in the 6 to 9 age range. She continued scrolling, her expression gradually shifting from skepticism to something approaching respect. These reviews, and the sales rankings. She looked up again. You really are successful, legitimately successful by any standard. By commercial standards, yes. Though I doubt my path would ever have satisfied Dad's vision for his son, regardless of financial outcome. I'm not so sure about that, Rebecca said, surprising me again. Not after reading his letter. I think he came to regret how narrowly he'd defined acceptable achievement for both of us. Both of us? She set down her phone, a shadow crossing her perfect features. You weren't the only one navigating Dad's expectations, Jamie. You just chose to reject them openly, while I built my entire life around meeting them. Stanford Law because Dad believed it was the best. Corporate practice because he valued security. And prestige over public interest work I might have preferred. Even this house. Do you think I would have chosen something this traditional if left entirely to my own preferences? This glimpse beneath Rebecca's carefully constructed perfect life caught me off guard. I had always assumed she was exactly where and who she wanted to be, the golden child who had naturally selected and excelled at a path our father approved of. The suggestion that she, too, had compromised authentic desires to meet expectations shook my long-standing narrative about our different paths. I hadn't realized, I admitted. You always seemed so aligned with what Dad valued, so certain about your choices. Because that was safer than admitting doubt or ambivalence. You chose external rebellion. I chose internal accommodation. Different responses to the same parental expectations. She smiled faintly. Though it seems you managed to build a successful life on your own terms while maintaining the fiction of failure, which is its own kind of genius. The compliment, however reluctant, marked a subtle shift in our interaction, the first acknowledgement that my life choices might merit respect rather than dismissal. What do we do now? I asked, returning to the immediate question of the inheritance and its implications for our family relationships. Dad's decision has clearly come as a shock to you and Mom. I'm not here to create additional family discord. Rebecca sighed, her lawyer's mind apparently shifting to practical considerations. Legally, there's nothing to be done. Dad's will is clear. And from this letter, it's evident he was of sound mind and had specific reasons for his estate distribution. No grounds for contest, even if I were inclined to pursue that route, which I'm not. I'm not asking about legal options. I'm asking about us. What this means for our relationship, for your relationship with Mom, for how we move forward. She was silent for a moment, considering. I don't know yet. I need time to process all this. The revelation about your career, Dad's secret knowledge, his estate decisions. It's a lot to absorb in one morning. Of course. I moved toward the door, sensing that we had reached the natural conclusion of this initial conversation. Take whatever time you need. I'll be in town until tomorrow afternoon if you want to talk again before I leave. Wait. Rebecca stood, her expression uncharacteristically uncertain. Do you have pictures? Of your work, I mean? Your studio or whatever? The request surprised me, but I nodded, pulling out my phone. Some? Yes. She moved closer as I pulled up photos of my workspace, the illustrations in progress, the gallery exhibition preparations. Her expression shifted as she swiped through the images, seeing for the first time the tangible evidence of the creative life I'd built beyond her awareness. These are really good, she said finally, lingering on a photo of me working on a large canvas. The children's illustrations and these more serious paintings both. You have actual talent. Coming from Rebecca, this qualified as effusive praise. Thank you. That means something, coming from you. She handed back the phone, our fingers briefly touching in the exchange. I need to tell Mom about this conversation. She deserves to know what was in Dad's letter, to understand his decisions. I agree. I was planning to visit her this afternoon. Let me talk to her first, Rebecca suggested. Give her some context before you arrive with this revelation. It's a lot for anyone to process, but especially someone still grieving her husband of 47 years. I nodded, recognizing the wisdom in her approach. Call me when you think would be a good time for me to come by. As I turned to leave, Rebecca called after me, her voice holding an unfamiliar note of hesitation. Jamie, would you bring one of your books when you come? I'd like to see the actual work, not just online images. The request, simple, human, an acknowledgement of interest in something I'd created, felt like the first tentative bridge across decades of misunderstanding. I have some in my hotel room, I said. I always travel with copies, occupational habit. A faint smile, perhaps the first genuine one she'd directed at me in years. I'll call you after I talk to Mom. I drove back to my hotel in a state of stunned reflection, trying to process the seismic shift in my relationship with Rebecca. Not reconciliation exactly, but the first tremors of what might eventually become a more authentic connection, one based on who we actually were, rather, than the roles we'd been assigned in the family narrative. My phone rang as I was parking at the hotel. Paolo, checking in about the animation production meeting scheduled for Monday morning. Everything on track for your return tomorrow? He asked after I confirmed I'd be back for the meeting. Any developments with the inheritance situation? You could say that, I replied, realizing I now faced the strange task of explaining to my business partner and friend that I had inherited $23 million from the father who had supposedly been permanently disappointed in my life choices. It's complicated. I'll fill you in when I get back. Complicated is your specialty, Paolo observed with characteristic perception. It's what makes Elliot's world so compelling, that balance of simplicity and depth. After hanging up, I sat in the car for a moment, struck by the parallels between my creative work and my personal life. In my books, Elliot navigated a world where things were rarely as simple as they initially appeared, where assumptions were gently challenged, where understanding required looking beneath surface appearances. Without fully realizing it, I had been working through my own experiences of family misunderstanding in the stories I created for children, offering them a more compassionate perspective than I had been able to achieve in my actual family relationships. My phone chimed with a text from Rebecca. "Talk to Mom. She's processing but wants to see you. Can you come by around 2?" I confirmed the time, then headed to my room to collect the books I'd bring to this unexpected family reunion. Tangible evidence of the life I'd built beyond their awareness. The success I'd achieved on my own terms. The creative voice I'd developed while they assumed I was drifting without purpose or achievement. As I gathered the hardcover volumes, the adventures of an elephant who found extraordinary possibilities in ordinary situations, I wondered what my father would think of this development. His posthumous confession had catalyzed a potential reconnection he hadn't lived to see, opening the possibility for a more honest relationship between his children than had ever existed during his lifetime. Perhaps that was his final, unintended gift. Not the financial inheritance that had shocked Rebecca and my mother, but the truth that might eventually allow us to see each other clearly for the first time. My mother's reaction to the revelation of my secret career was more complex than Rebecca's, filtered through the additional lens of grief and the protective instincts of a parent who had lost her life partner less than 2 weeks earlier. "I wish he had told me," she said quietly after examining the books I'd brought, her fingers tracing my name on the covers. "All these years, keeping this knowledge to himself while letting me believe you were struggling. It feels like a betrayal of me, of our partnership." We were sitting in her immaculate living room, Rebecca perched on the arm of my mother's chair like a protective sentinel. The books were arranged on the coffee table between us, physical evidence of the creative life that had remained hidden from my family for so long. I think he struggled with how to reveal what he knew without acknowledging how deeply he had misunderstood me, I suggested. By the time he discovered the books, the pattern was too established to easily break. "And you?" My mother's gaze shifted. From the books to me, her expression a mixture of hurt and confusion. "Why maintain this deception for so long? Were we so terrible that you couldn't share your success with us?" It was the question at the heart of everything. Why I had chosen distance and misunderstanding over honesty, even as my career flourished and financial success accumulated. The same question my father had grappled with in his letter, the one Rebecca had posed in her kitchen earlier that day. "It wasn't about terrible or not terrible," I said carefully. "It was about the narratives we establish in families, the roles we assign and accept." Early on, when I left college and took what seemed like a directionless path, the disappointment was so palpable that it became easier to simply accept that role, the family failure, than to constantly justify choices that didn't align with your and Dad's vision of success. "We wanted security for you," my mother protested. "A stable career, a clear path. What parent doesn't want that for their child?" "I know, and I don't blame you for those hopes. But when my definition of fulfillment diverged from yours, the gap seemed unbridgeable." By the time the first book found success, it felt easier to maintain the established dynamic than to challenge it. "So you let us worry about you," she said, echoing Rebecca's earlier accusation. "Let us believe you were barely making ends meet when in fact you were doing well," I finished when she trailed off. "Building something meaningful on my own terms. And now Daniel has left you the bulk of his estate," she continued, a hint of her own bewilderment showing through her composed exterior. "To add to the fortune you apparently already possessed." "I didn't know about Dad's intentions," I assured her. "I was as shocked as you and Rebecca. I assumed any inheritance would be primarily directed to Becca, with perhaps some token bequest to me." "He never consulted me about these changes to his estate plan," my mother said, a flash of the hurt she must be feeling breaking through her controlled facade. "All those years of partnership, and he restructured everything without a word." Rebecca placed a comforting hand on our mother's shoulder. "I think Dad was ashamed, Mom, of how he'd misjudged Jamie, of the relationship he'd damaged through that misunderstanding. The letter makes that clear, My mother nodded slightly, acknowledging the point while still processing the multiple revelations that had disrupted her understanding of both her late husband and her supposedly underachieving son. "What happens now?" she asked finally, the practical question emerging as she began to move through initial shock toward consideration of implications. "With the inheritance? With the firm? With everything?" "I'm still figuring that out," I admitted. "I've signed the paperwork transferring Dad's ownership interests and accounts, but I haven't had time to consider what that means long term. My life and work are established elsewhere." "You won't be moving back?" A hint of surprise in her voice, as if she had assumed the inheritance might draw me back to my hometown despite decades of deliberate distance. "No. My studio, my team, my creative life, they're all based where I live now. I can manage the ownership interests in Dad's firm remotely, with periodic visits when necessary." She nodded, seeming to accept this with the same composed resignation she brought to all life's disappointments. "And the house? When I move to Rebecca's guest house next month?" I glanced at Rebecca, who looked equally curious about my intentions. "Regarding the family home, I don't have specific plans yet. It holds significant memories, of course, but given that I won't be living here, selling might make the most sense eventually. Unless there are reasons to maintain it?" "No," my mother said after a moment of reflection. "Without Daniel, it's just a house. A rather large one for a widow to maintain, even with the support he arranged. Rebecca's solution makes much more sense at this point in my life." The practical discussion seemed to steady her, providing familiar ground after the emotional upheaval of learning about both my secret career and my father's private knowledge of it. We moved on to other logistical matters: the timeline for her move to Rebecca's guest house, the disposition of household items, the management of accounts my father had established for her support. Throughout this conversation, Rebecca remained unusually quiet, her lawyer's instinct for documentation temporarily suspended as she observed the interaction between mother and son. When we had exhausted the immediate practical questions, she finally spoke. "Would you show us your work?" she asked, gesturing to the books on the coffee table. "Not just the finished products, but how you create them. The process behind Elliot's World?" The request caught me off guard, not just the interest in my creative process, which neither Rebecca nor my mother had ever expressed before, but the implicit acknowledgement that my work had value worthy of their attention. "Sure," I said, reaching for the most recent Elliot book. This one started with a character sketch that evolved quite a bit before becoming the final version. For the next hour, I found myself explaining the creative and technical aspects of my work to my mother and sister: the initial concept development, the character refinement, the storytelling considerations, the illustration techniques. To my surprise, they asked thoughtful questions, examined the books with genuine interest, and gradually seemed to see me through a lens unclouded by long-held assumptions about my capabilities and choices. "These are remarkable, Jamie," my mother said finally, closing the last book with a care that suggested newfound respect. "I had no idea you had this talent within you." The belated recognition, coming after decades of perceived failure, should have felt hollow, perhaps even irritating. Instead, I found it strangely healing, a closing of a circle that had remained painfully open throughout my adult life. "Thank you," I said simply. "That means a lot coming from you." Rebecca checked, her watch ever mindful of schedules and commitments. "I should get back. Mark is on call tonight and the kids have activities." She hesitated, then added, "Will you be stopping by before you leave tomorrow? Claire would love to meet the creator of her favorite elephant, now that we know he's her uncle." The invitation represented another small bridge across the chasm of misunderstanding. Not complete reconciliation, but an opening toward a different kind of relationship than we had managed in the past. "I'd like that," I said. "Perhaps breakfast before my flight. I could bring sketches for Claire and Tyler if they'd be interested." "They'd be thrilled," Rebecca replied, a hint of genuine warmth in her smile. Tyler has the Elliot lunchbox, apparently. I never made the connection. As I prepared to leave, my mother surprised me with an embrace more substantial than her usual perfunctory hug. I wish your father had found the courage to address this while he was alive, she said quietly. For all our sakes. So do I acknowledged. But perhaps his letter makes possible the conversations we couldn't have while he was here. She nodded, her composure slightly fractured by emotion she rarely displayed. Will you stay in touch more regularly now that we understand more of who you actually are? It was a fair question, whether the revelation of my success would change the pattern of limited contact I had maintained for years. The answer wasn't simple. The distance hadn't been solely about hiding my career, but about managing relationships that had felt judgmental and constraining. I'd like to try, I said honestly. Not because of Dad's letter or the inheritance, but because maybe we can establish something more authentic now that certain misunderstandings have been cleared away. She seemed to accept this qualified response, recognizing perhaps that decades of mutual misperception couldn't be erased by a single afternoon of revelations. As I drove back to my hotel, I reflected on the strange journey of the past 10 days, from my father's funeral and Rebecca's casual cruelty to the unexpected inheritance and the shattering of long-established family narratives. None of us were who the others had believed us to be. Not my father, with his secret knowledge and private regrets. Not me, with my hidden success and carefully maintained distance. Not Rebecca, with her ambivalence about the approved path she had followed. Perhaps not even my mother, whose composed acceptance might mask complexities none of us had recognized. The family failure, it turned out, had been our collective inability to see each other clearly, to move beyond assigned roles and established narratives toward more authentic connection. Whether my father's posthumous revelations would ultimately heal that failure remained to be seen, but for the first time in decades it seemed possible that the truth might create space for something different to emerge. My phone rang as I was packing for the next day's departure. Paolo again, with questions about the animation production schedule. Sorry to bother you on your family weekend, he apologized after we had resolved the immediate concerns. Everything settling down there? Actually, yes, I replied, surprised to find it was true. In unexpected ways. Good unexpected or complicated unexpected. I thought about Rebecca's invitation for breakfast, my mother's request for more regular contact, the altered understanding that was beginning to take shape in our long-strained relationships. Both, I said finally. Definitely both. After hanging up, I completed my packing, setting aside the sketches I would create for my niece and nephew before morning, small bridges across the gap that had separated me from their lives until now. Whatever came next in this transformed family, dynamic, it would be built on truth rather than misunderstanding, on who we actually were rather than who we had assumed each other to be. My sister had called me a failure at our father's funeral, giving voice to the narrative that had defined my place in the family for decades. She hadn't known then about my success, about my father's secret knowledge, about the inheritance that would upend her understanding of family dynamics. But perhaps the greater revelation wasn't financial or professional, but personal. The discovery that beneath our assigned roles and defensive positions, we were more complex and less understood than any of us had realized. The greatest inheritance my father had left might not be the material wealth that had shocked Rebecca and my mother, but the truth that had created space for us to finally begin seeing each other clearly. I woke to the sound of rain gently tapping against the hotel window. That steady rhythm reminded me so much of the nights from my childhood, when I would curl up beneath the sheets in my old bedroom just a few miles from here. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had traveled the world telling stories to millions of children, but I had never managed to tell my own story to the people from whom I most craved understanding. Elliot, my elephant with kind eyes and a brave heart, had been born from my own insecurities and longings. I had created him during those first years in New York, away from my family, in a small apartment where the silence threatened to consume me. An elephant who taught children that being different wasn't a curse but a gift, that appearances deceive, and that sometimes those who seem strongest are the ones who most need understanding. I sat up in bed and looked at the clock. 6:47 a.m. In a few hours, I would reunite with my family after 8 years of absence. 8 years since that terrible argument with my father, since those hurtful words that still echoed in my head. "That's not a real job," he had said with disdain about my career as a children's book writer. "When are you going to do something that matters?" What he never understood, what none of them understood, was that every word I wrote for Elliot was a way of healing the child I had been. Each adventure of my gray elephant was an attempt to create the kind of comfort that I myself had desperately needed in that house where success was measured solely in academic titles and stable salaries. The hotel coffee was surprisingly good, nothing like the watery liquid I remembered from local cafes. My town had changed, as had I. New shops occupied previously empty spaces, unfamiliar faces replaced familiar ones. However, the essence remained, that particular air of a small place where everyone seems to know your story before you do. My phone vibrated with a message from Elena, my editor. "Everything okay? Remember, whatever the outcome, Elliot's Adventures on Lost Summit needs to be in my inbox by next Monday." I smiled. Elena, always perfectly balancing empathy and deadlines. I replied with a terse, "Everything under control," though nothing could be further from the truth. The call that had brought me back had taken me by surprise 3 days ago. My mother's voice, trembling but determined. "Your father is ill, Michael. We're not asking you to come, just thought you should know." In those words, I had heard what she wasn't saying, my father's unbreakable pride, the real possibility that this might be the last chance, the fear. And although part of me wanted to respond with the same rejection I had received for years, I found my voice saying, "I'll be there." The rental car seemed unnecessarily large for just me, but it was all they had available. As I drove through the familiar streets, each turn revealed a memory. The library where I'd spent countless afternoons escaping into stories, the park bench where I first sketched Elliot on a napkin, the high school where teachers had told me to be practical about my future. My father had been one of the town's most respected surgeons, a man whose hands could repair broken bodies but never knew how to mend a broken spirit, particularly that of a son who preferred stories to science. My mother, always caught between her husband's expectations and her child's dreams, had retreated into a careful neutrality that, over time, had felt increasingly like abandonment. And then there was Lydia, my younger sister, who had followed our father's path into medicine with a precision that only deepened the contrast between us. Our last conversation had ended with her frustrated voice. "Why do you have to make everything so difficult? Why can't you just give him what he wants?" The familiar ache returned to my chest as I turned onto Maple Street. The neighborhood hadn't changed much. Same neat lawns, same tasteful houses, same sense of conformity that had once suffocated me. My parents' home stood at the end, a colonial-style house with white columns that had always reminded me of a courthouse, a place of judgment rather than comfort. I parked across the street, unable to bring myself to pull into the driveway just yet. Through the windshield, distorted by raindrops, the house seemed smaller than in my memory. Or perhaps I had grown larger, not in size but in my understanding of the world and myself. I reached into my bag and pulled out the first Elliot book, worn and dog-eared from years of readings at libraries and schools. The cover showed my elephant protagonist looking up at a star-filled sky, his trunk reaching toward constellations beyond his grasp. Elliot and the Impossible Stars, the title that had launched my career and, in many ways, saved my life. My Father had never read it, of course. Picture books, he'd scoffed when my mother had proudly shown him the published copy. Is that what your expensive education was for? I traced my finger over Elliot's illustrated form, remembering the countless letters from children and parents telling me how this character had helped them through difficult times, how he had made them feel less alone. I had a box full of such letters in my apartment in New York, a testament to the impact my work had made. Validation I had desperately sought from the man in the house before me. My phone rang, startling me from my thoughts. Lydia's name flashed on the screen. "Where are you?" Her voice sounded strained, less confident than I remembered. "Outside," I admitted. "Just gathering my thoughts." A pause, then. "He's having a good day. He's in the study." Another pause. "He doesn't know I called you." Of course he didn't. My father would never admit needing anyone, least of all the son who had disappointed him so thoroughly. "I'll be right in," I said, ending the call before she could respond. I sat for another minute, rain drumming on the roof of the car, and thought about what Elliot would do in this situation. In Elliot Faces the Storm, my fourth book, he had encountered a tempest that threatened to destroy his forest home. Rather than running away, he had stood his ground, using his great ears as shields for the smaller animals, finding strength in his vulnerability. It was time for me to face my own storm. The walk to the front door felt like miles. Each step brought back fragments of my childhood. Running down this same path after school, excited to show my mother a story I'd written. Trudging up it with slumped shoulders after my father had dismissed a perfect report card with, "That's what's expected, nothing more." Standing frozen on the welcome mat the night I announced I was moving to New York to pursue writing, my father's cold, "Then go," still cutting through me years later. Before I could knock, the door opened. My mother stood there, her hair grayer than I remembered, her face lined with years I had missed. For a moment, we simply stared at each other, the rain creating a curtain between us and the rest of the world. "Michael," she said finally, my name carrying the weight of 8 years of silence. "Mom," I replied. And suddenly we were embracing, awkwardly at first, then with the desperate grip of those who have been drowning separately and finally found something to hold on to. When we pulled apart, I saw Lydia standing in the hallway. Behind her, my sister looked both familiar and strange, her practical haircut and posture so similar to our mother's, yet something new in her eyes. Wariness, perhaps, or weariness. "You came," she said simply. "I came," I confirmed. She nodded once, a clinical assessment completed, then gestured toward the back of the house. "He's in the study. Go easy. The medication makes him tired." My mother squeezed my arm. "I'll make some tea," she said, retreating toward the kitchen, her default response to any emotional situation. The house smelled the same, lemon polish and old books, with the underlying hint of antiseptic that had followed my father home from the hospital throughout my childhood. Family photos lined the hallway, charting a carefully curated history. Graduations, vacations, achievements. I noticed that the most recent ones showed only my parents and Lydia. It was as if I had been erased after my departure, a branch pruned from the family tree. But then, near the study door, I spotted something unexpected, a framed magazine cover, The Visionaries of Children's Literature, featuring an interview with me from 3 years ago. I had sent it to my mother without expectation, a small flag raised in the silence between us. She had kept it, displayed it even. I stood before the study door, hand raised to knock, when I heard my father's voice from within. Not the booming authority I remembered, but softer, strained. "Is someone here?" I heard the door. I closed my eyes, feeling like that scared 22-year-old again, about to face judgment. But I wasn't that person anymore. I was 35 now, with a life built on my own terms, with readers who found value in my work, with an understanding of myself that had come at great cost, but had proven worth every painful step. I knocked gently and opened the door. The study had always been my father's domain, a place of leather-bound medical journals and sober discussions about reality. As a child, being summoned there usually meant some failure on my part needed addressing. Now, entering as an adult, I was struck by how ordinary it seemed. Just a room with books and a desk, and an old man sitting in a large chair by the window. My father looked up and I saw the shock register in his eyes. He was thinner, paler, a diminished version of the Titan who had loomed so large in my memories. Gray had overtaken the black in his hair, and the hands that had performed countless surgeries now trembled slightly on the armrests of his chair. "Michael," he said, his voice betraying more emotion than I had heard from him in all my childhood years combined. "Dad?" I replied, standing awkwardly just inside the doorway, unsure whether to approach or maintain this safe distance. He gestured to the chair opposite his. "Sit, please." I moved across the room, feeling the weight of his gaze. A medical assessment, perhaps, or something more personal. I sat facing him, noticing the oxygen tank discreetly positioned beside his chair, the pill bottles arranged in neat rows on the side table. "Your mother called you," he said, not a question. "No," I answered truthfully. "Lydia did." He nodded, a slight smile tightening his lips. "Always the mediator, your sister." Silence stretched between us, filled with 8 years of unspoken words and unshared experiences. Through the window behind him, I could see the backyard oak tree where I had built a treehouse as a child. My first real effort to create a world apart from the one my father had designed. "I read your books," he said finally, the words so unexpected that I almost asked him to repeat them. "You read my books?" He nodded, gesturing to a shelf I hadn't noticed, where a complete collection of my Eliot series stood, spines clearly worn from opening. All of them, multiple times in fact. I struggled to process this information, this reality so at odds with the narrative I had carried for 8 years. I thought you disapproved, that you saw them as meaningless." My father looked down at his hands, those hands that had been so sure, so confident in the operating room but had never known how to hold a son who dreamed differently than he did. "I was wrong," he said simply, the words hanging in the air between us like some rare and precious thing. I waited for the qualification, the but, that would inevitably follow, explaining how I could have done more, been more, achieved something greater. It didn't come. Instead, he reached for a book on the side table. Eliot and the Bridge Between Worlds, my most recent publication. He opened it to a page I knew well, where Eliot finally reconciles with his estranged father. "This elephant?" my father said, his finger tracing the illustration. "He's you, isn't he? And this old elephant here, the stubborn one who cannot see beyond his own trunk? That's me." The directness of the question caught me off guard. For years, I had carefully deflected similar inquiries from journalists and readers, maintaining that Eliot was a creation separate from myself. But here, with the man who had shaped so much of who I was and who I had fought not to be, honesty seemed the only possible path. "Yes," I admitted. "At least, parts of us. The best parts of me, I hope, and not just the worst parts of you." He closed the book gently, hands trembling slightly more now. "Your mother has been reading them to the children at the hospital. Did you know that?" I shook my head, something tightening in my chest. "They have a program for the long-term pediatric patients. She volunteers twice a week. Those children?" He paused, clearing his throat. "Those children light up when Eliot appears. They see themselves in him. Different. Afraid sometimes, but brave when it matters." I couldn't speak. This was so far from the conversation I had expected, had rehearsed, On the flight, in the car, standing in the rain. I spent my career fixing broken bodies, my father continued, looking past me now, his gaze distant. Tangible problems with tangible solutions. Cut, stitch, repair. I could measure success in lab values and vital signs. He met my eyes again. What you do, reaching into minds and hearts, helping people see themselves differently, that's not something I understood. Not then. And now? I asked, my voice barely audible. Now I have time to think. Too much time, perhaps. He gestured to the oxygen tank. Stage 4 lung cancer gives one a certain perspective. The clinical detachment in his voice failed to mask the reality of what he was saying. Lydia, a doctor herself, would have known exactly what this meant when she called me. This wasn't just illness. This was the beginning of the end. How long? I asked, falling into the direct language my family had always used for difficult truths. A few months, maybe less. He said it matter-of-factly, as though discussing someone else's prognosis. Which is why I need to say some things to you, things I should have said years ago. He leaned forward, eyes suddenly intense, the doctor who had never minced words, who had always believed in facing reality head-on, however painful. I was wrong about your work, wrong to dismiss it, wrong to make you feel it wasn't valuable. I was afraid you'd struggle, afraid you'd fail in a world I didn't understand. So I pushed you toward what I knew, what had given me security and status. I couldn't see that you needed something different. I sat perfectly still, afraid that any movement might break whatever spell had transformed my unyielding father into this reflective man before me. The irony, he continued with a soft, bitter laugh, is that you've had far more impact than I ever did. I might have saved hundreds of lives in my career. Important work, yes, but you... He gestured to the shelf of my books. You've shaped thousands of minds, helped children face their fears, see possibilities where others see only obstacles. Dad, I began, but he raised a hand, the surgeon, taking control. Let me finish. I need to finish. He took a labored breath. Your character, Elliot, he teaches children that being different isn't something to overcome but something to embrace. That seeing the world uniquely is a gift. His voice caught slightly. I wish I had understood that when you were young. I wish I had celebrated your differences instead of trying to correct them. The rain had stopped outside, a sudden stillness replacing its steady rhythm. Sunlight broke through the clouds, casting a warm rectangle across the carpet between us. It's not too late, I said, the words escaping before I could consider them. To understand each other, I mean. My father looked at me, really looked, at me perhaps for the first time in my adult life. No, he agreed quietly. It's not too late for that. From down the hall came the sound of my mother's voice, calling us to lunch as though it were any ordinary day, as though there weren't 8 years, and a terminal diagnosis hanging between her husband and son. As though families could simply resume, picking up broken threads and weaving them back into the pattern. My father struggled to rise from his chair, waving away my instinctive move to help him. Old habits die hard, even in the face of new understandings. He stood finely, swaying slightly, dignity intact. Your mother's been cooking all morning, he said. She always believed you'd come back eventually. And you? I couldn't help asking. Did you believe I'd come back? He considered this, head tilted in that familiar way that had always preceded his most honest assessments. No, he admitted. I believed I had lost you for good. I believed I deserved to lose you. He paused at the study door. I'm glad I was wrong about that too. As we walked slowly down the hallway, the successful author and the dying doctor, the son and the father, 2 storytellers of different kinds, I thought again of Elliot, who had begun as my escape from this family, but had somehow become my bridge back to them. In Elliot and the Echo Canyon, my elephant discovers that the frightening echoes he hears are actually reflections of his own fears, amplified and distorted by distance and misunderstanding. The resolution comes not from shouting louder, but from listening differently, hearing past the initial harsh sounds to the vulnerable questions beneath. My father paused at a family photograph I hadn't noticed before. Recent, taken perhaps last Christmas. Lydia and my mother smiled at the camera, while my father looked slightly away, his expression distant. But what caught my attention was the small toy elephant just visible on the mantel behind them, a stuffed Elliot from the merchandise line, his trunk raised in that characteristic gesture of hopeful questioning. "Lydia gave me that," my father said, following my gaze. After her first leukemia patient, a 7-year-old girl asked if she knew Elliot's creator personally. He shook his head slightly. She told the girl yes, that Elliot's creator was her brother, and that he was the bravest person she knew. I swallowed hard, unprepared for this glimpse into my sister's private thoughts, her loyalty despite our distance. "I didn't know," I managed. "There's a lot we don't know about each other," my father replied, his hand briefly touching my shoulder, an unprecedented gesture that spoke volumes. "But perhaps we can change that, with whatever time remains." In the dining room, my mother and sister had set the table with the good china, an honor previously reserved for holidays and visiting dignitaries of my father's medical world. 4 place settings, as though my place had always been waiting for me to return and claim it. My mother's eyes were red-rimmed, but her smile was genuine as she set down a steaming casserole, my childhood favorite that I hadn't tasted in nearly a decade. Lydia stood awkwardly by her chair, still the dutiful daughter but watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "I hope you're hungry," my mother said, filling the silence with the practical concerns that had always been her domain. "I made enough for leftovers. You could take some back to your hotel." "Actually," I found myself saying, "I was thinking I might stay here. If that's all right. For a few days at least." The relief on my mother's face, the slight nod from my father, the unexpected smile from Lydia. These simple responses contained years of unspoken longing, of doors left deliberately unlocked despite evidence that no one would ever walk through them again. "Your room is exactly as you left it," my mother said, her voice steady despite the emotion shining in her eyes. "I dusted every week." My father lowered himself carefully into his chair at the head of the table, oxygen tank beside him like some new family member we were all pretending not to notice. "Perhaps," he said with unexpected lightness, "you could tell us about the new Elliot book you're working on while we eat." And so I did. As the afternoon sun streamed through the dining room windows, illuminating the dust motes that danced between us like tiny messengers carrying words too long unspoken, I told them about Elliot's newest adventure. Story of homecoming, of seeing familiar landscapes with new eyes, of finding unexpected treasures in places once fled. I didn't tell them that I had been struggling with the ending, unable to resolve the tension between Elliot's independent life and his connections to where he began. I didn't tell them that sitting here, watching my father's attentive expression, my mother's gentle hands, my sister's gradual relaxation, I was beginning to see how that ending might unfold. Later, after my father had retired to rest and my mother was busy in the kitchen, Lydia and I found ourselves alone on the back porch, the awkwardness between us both familiar and strange. "You should have told me how bad it was," I said finally. She twisted her wedding ring, a new addition since I'd last seen her. "Would you have come if I had? If I'd said he was dying?" I considered this honestly. "I don't know. That's why I didn't say it," she replied simply. After a moment, she added, "He changed, you know. After your 3rd book came out, the one where Elliot finds his purpose, I remembered it well. The book where my elephant protagonist finally stops trying to fit into the expectations of others and embraces his unique abilities, using his large ears not just to hear, but to understand the unspoken needs of those around him. He bought copies for every pediatric patient in his ward. Lydia continued. Read it during his rounds. Started asking the children what made them special, what unique perspectives they brought to the world. She shook her head slightly. The other doctors thought he was having some kind of breakdown. The great Dr. James Winters asking children about their imaginary friends and favorite colors. I tried to picture this. My father, who had once dismissed a childhood drawing of mine as impractical use of time, engaging with patients about their dreams and perceptions. It seemed as impossible as the talking elephant I had created. Why didn't anyone tell me? I asked, the hurt of these lost years rising unexpectedly. Lydia met my eyes directly, her gaze so like our father's, assessing, unflinching. You changed your phone number, returned Mom's letters, made it very clear you wanted nothing to do with us. She shrugged. Pride runs in the family, in case you hadn't noticed. She was right, of course. I had built walls as solid as my father's, nurturing my grievances alongside my creations until they had become indistinguishable. The rejected son and the successful author, two sides of the same, carefully constructed identity. He kept track of you, though, she continued. Every interview, every book signing within driving distance, he'd sit in the back, watch you with all those children, never approached you, but he'd come home and tell us every detail. What you wore, how you made the kids laugh, the questions you answered. I closed my eyes, imagining my father, rigid, formal, perpetually disappointed, sitting among excited children at a bookstore, watching his estranged son bring a stuffed elephant to life through voices and gestures. The image was both painful and strangely healing. He was trying to understand, Lydia said softly, in his own way. Inside the house, a clock chimed 6 times. The light was changing, afternoon deepening toward evening. In a few hours, I would need to call Elena, my editor, update her on my progress with the manuscript. But for now, there was only this porch, this conversation, this tentative bridge being constructed word by careful word. I have a son, Lydia said suddenly, 2 years old, named Michael. The information hit me with physical force. I had a nephew, a child who shared my name, who existed in the world without my knowledge. You named him after me? I asked, disbelieving. She nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Dad suggested it, actually. Said there should always be a Michael Winters in the family, even if the original wouldn't speak to us. I laughed then, the sound surprising both of us. Genuine amusement at the complex, maddening, endlessly contradictory nature of family connections. My father, unable to tell me directly that he missed me, finding a way to keep my name present in his daily life. I'd like to meet him, I said. My namesake. He's with my husband's parents this weekend. Lydia hesitated. But they're bringing him home tomorrow. He has all your books. Sleeps with a stuffed Elliot. The thought of a child I'd never met, blood of my blood, clutching the character who had been my own companion through lonely years, created a connection that transcended the broken relationships between the adults in our family. From inside came the sound of my mother's voice, calling Lydia to help with something in the kitchen. My sister stood, pausing at the porch door. He's proud of you, you know, she said. Even if he's only learning how to say it now, when time is... She stopped, collecting herself. Don't waste the chance, Michael. I've seen too many patients realize too late what matters. After she left, I sat watching the sunset paint the backyard in shades of gold and amber. The treehouse in the oak was gone, removed years ago according to my mother, but I could still see it in my mind's eye. The place where I had first dreamed of worlds beyond this one, where I had sketched early versions of what would become Elliot, where I had believed that stories could create realities as valid and vital as the concrete facts my father prized. I thought about the manuscript waiting on my laptop, the latest Elliot adventure half finished. I had planned a story about Elliot finding a hidden valley where peculiar animals lived in isolation, afraid of the outside world's judgment. It had been meant as a metaphor for finding one's artistic community, for the chosen families that so many creatives assemble around themselves. But now, sitting on the porch of my childhood home, I wondered if perhaps the story wasn't about finding a new family at all, but about reconciling with the old one, about bridging the space between where we come from and who we become, about recognizing that both can exist simultaneously within us. I pulled out my phone and opened the Notes app where I sometimes jotted ideas. I typed, "Elliot returns to his birth herd, finding they have changed in his absence. The fear that once drove him away has been replaced by something unexpected. Understanding. But has he changed too much to reconnect? Or just enough to build something new from the fragments of what was broken?" A light came on in my father's study, casting a warm rectangle onto the lawn. Through the window, I could see him settling into his chair, reaching for one of my books. Even from this distance, I could tell which one: Elliot and the Invisible. Bridge, where my protagonist discovers that connections thought severed still exist, unseen but enduring. I watched as my father opened the book, his face softening as he entered the world I had created. A world born from the pain of our separation, but which now, through some strange alchemy, was becoming a path back to each other. Tomorrow, I would meet my nephew. I would sit with my father and ask all the questions we had avoided for a lifetime. I would help my mother in the kitchen and talk with my sister about her work, her life, her son. I would begin filling in the vast blank spaces in our shared story. But tonight, watching my father read about an elephant who had always been seeking his way home, I understood that the ending I had been struggling to write was already unfolding around me. The reckoning I had both feared and longed for wasn't a climactic confrontation, but this, the quiet acknowledgement of shared imperfection, the gentle reclamation of time thought lost. I opened a new message to Alina. "The book is taking an unexpected turn. I need a few more days. It's going to be better than I promised." Her reply came almost immediately. "Family reunion going well then?" I smiled, typing, "We're learning to read each other's stories, finally." As darkness settled over the yard, I thought again of Elliot, who had begun as my escape, but had become, improbably, my way back. In creating him, I had given voice to the child within me who had never felt understood. Now, it seemed that very creation was teaching me how to understand others, how to see beneath surface appearances to the extraordinary possibilities hiding in unexpected places. I stood and walked toward the house, toward the light in my father's study, toward whatever remaining chapters we might write together in the time that remained. The failure, it seemed, had never been me at all, but the stories we had constructed and maintained about each other, stories that could now perhaps begin to change. I woke to the sound of rain gently tapping against the hotel window. That steady rhythm reminded me so much of the nights from my childhood, when I would curl up beneath the sheets in my old bedroom just a few miles from here. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had traveled the world telling stories to millions of children, but I had never managed to tell my own story to the people from whom I most craved understanding. Elliot, my elephant with kind eyes and a brave heart, had been born from my own insecurities and longings. I had created him during those first years in New York, away from my family, in a small apartment where the silence threatened to consume me, an elephant who taught children that being different wasn't a curse but a gift, that appearances deceive and that sometimes those who seem strongest are the ones who most need understanding. I sat up in bed and looked at the clock, 6:47 a.m. In a few hours, I would reunite with my family after 8 years of absence. 8 years since that terrible argument with my father, since those hurtful words that still echoed in my head. "That's not a real job," he had said with disdain about my career as a children's book writer. "When are you going to do something that matters?" What he never understood, what none of them understood, was that every word I wrote for Elliot was a way, of healing the child I had been. Each adventure of my gray elephant was an attempt to create the kind of comfort that I myself had desperately needed in that house where success was measured solely in academic titles and stable salaries. The hotel coffee was surprisingly good. Nothing like the watery liquid I remembered from local cafes. My town had changed, as had I. New shops occupied previously empty spaces. Unfamiliar faces replaced familiar ones. However, the essence remained, that particular air of a small place where everyone seems to know your story before you do. My phone vibrated with a message from Elena, my editor. Everything okay? Remember, whatever the outcome, Elliot's adventures. On Lost Summit needs to be in my inbox by next Monday. I smiled. Elena, always perfectly balancing empathy and deadlines. I replied with a terse, everything under control, though nothing could be further from the truth. The call that had brought me back had taken me by surprise 3 days ago. My mother's voice, trembling but determined. Your father is ill, Michael. We're not asking you to come, just thought you should know. In those words, I had heard what she wasn't saying, my father's unbreakable pride, the real possibility that this might be the last chance, the fear. And although part of me wanted to respond with the same rejection I had received for years, I found my voice saying, I'll be there. The rental car seemed unnecessarily large for just me, but it was all they had available. As I drove through the familiar streets, each turn revealed a memory. The library where I'd spent countless afternoons escaping into stories. The park bench where I first sketched Elliot on a napkin. The high school where teachers had told me to be practical about my future. My father had been one of the town's most respected surgeons, a man whose hands could repair broken bodies but never knew how to mend a broken spirit, particularly that of a son who preferred stories to science. My mother, always caught between her husband's expectations and her child's dreams, had retreated into a careful neutrality that, over time, had felt increasingly like abandonment. And then there was Lydia, my younger sister, who had followed our father's path into medicine with a precision that only deepened the contrast between us. Our last conversation had ended with her frustrated voice. Why do you have to make everything so difficult? Why can't you just give him what he wants? The familiar ache returned to my chest as I turned onto Maple Street. The neighborhood hadn't changed much. Same neat lawns, same tasteful houses, same sense of conformity that had once suffocated me. My parents' home stood at the end, a colonial-style house with white columns that had always reminded me of a courthouse, a place of judgment rather than comfort. I parked across the street, unable to bring myself to pull into the driveway just yet. Through the windshield, distorted by raindrops, the house seemed smaller than in my memory. Or perhaps I had grown larger, not in size, but in my understanding of the world and myself. I reached into my bag and pulled out the first Eliot book, worn and dog-eared from years of readings at libraries and schools. The cover showed my elephant protagonist looking up at a star-filled sky, his trunk reaching toward constellations beyond his grasp. Elliot and the Impossible Stars, the title that had launched my career and, in many ways, saved my life. My father had never read it, of course. Picture books, he'd scoffed when my mother had proudly shown him the published copy. Is that what your expensive education was for? I traced my finger over Elliot's illustrated form, remembering the countless letters from children and parents telling me how this character had helped them through difficult times, how he had made them feel less alone. I had a box full of such letters in my apartment in New York, a testament to the impact my work had made, validation I had desperately sought from the man in the house before me. My phone rang, startling me from my thoughts. Lydia's name flashed on the screen. Where are you? Her voice sounded strained, less confident than I remembered. Outside, I admitted. Just gathering my thoughts. A pause, then, he's having a good day. He's in the study. Another pause. He doesn't know I called you." Of course he didn't. My father would never admit needing anyone, least of all the son who had disappointed him so thoroughly. "I'll be right in," I said, ending the call before she could respond. I sat for another minute, rain drumming on the roof of the car, and thought about what Elliot would do in this situation. In Elliot Faces the Storm, my fourth book, he had encountered a tempest that threatened to destroy his forest home. Rather than running away, he had stood his ground, using his great ears as shields for the smaller animals, finding strength in his vulnerability. It was time for me to face my own storm. The walk to the front door felt like miles. Each step brought back fragments of my childhood. Running down this same path after school, excited to show my mother a story I'd written. Trudging up it with slumped shoulders after my father had dismissed a perfect report card with, "That's what's expected, nothing more." Standing frozen on the welcome mat the night I announced I was moving to New York to pursue writing, my father's cold, "Then go," still cutting through me years later. Before I could knock, the door opened. My mother stood there, her hair grayer than I remembered, her face lined with years I had missed. For a moment, we simply stared at each other, the rain creating a curtain between us and the rest of the world. "Michael," she said finally, my name carrying the weight of 8 years of silence. "Mom," I replied. And suddenly, we were embracing, awkwardly at first, then with the desperate grip of those who have been drowning separately and finally found something to hold on to. When we pulled apart, I saw Lydia standing in the hallway, behind her. My sister looked both familiar and strange, her practical haircut and posture so similar to our mother's, yet something new in her eyes. Wariness, perhaps, or weariness. "You came," she said simply. "I came," I confirmed. She nodded once, a clinical assessment completed, then gestured toward the back of the house. "He's in the study. Go easy, the medication makes him tired." My mother squeezed my arm. "I'll make some tea," she said, retreating toward the kitchen, her default response to any emotional situation. The house smelled the same, lemon polish and old books, with the underlying hint of antiseptic that had followed my father home from the hospital throughout my childhood. Family photos lined the hallway, charting a carefully curated history. Graduations, vacations, achievements. I noticed that the most recent ones showed only my parents and Lydia. It was as if I had been erased after my departure, a branch pruned from the family tree. But then, near the study door, I spotted something unexpected, a framed magazine cover, The Visionaries of Children's Literature, featuring an interview with me from 3 years ago. I had sent it to my mother without expectation, a small flag raised in the silence between us. She had kept it, displayed it even. I stood before the study door, hand raised to knock, when I heard my father's voice from within. Not the booming authority I remembered, but softer, strained. "Is someone here?" I heard the door. I closed my eyes, feeling like that scared 22-year-old again, about to face judgment. But I wasn't that person anymore. I was 35 now, with a life built on my own terms, with readers who found value in my work, with an understanding of myself that had come at great cost but had proven worth every painful step. I knocked gently and opened the door. The study had always been my father's domain, a place of leather-bound medical journals and sober discussions about reality. As a child, being summoned there usually meant some failure on my part needed addressing. Now, entering as an adult, I was struck by how ordinary it seemed. Just a room with books and a desk and an old man sitting in a large chair by the window. My father looked up and I saw the shock register in his eyes. He was thinner, paler, a diminished version of the Titan who had loomed so large in my memories. Gray had overtaken the black in his hair, and the hands that had performed countless surgeries now trembled slightly on the armrests of his chair. "Michael," he said, his voice betraying more emotion than I had heard from him in all my childhood years combined. "Dad," I replied, standing awkwardly just inside the doorway, unsure whether to approach or maintain this safe distance. He gestured to the chair opposite his. "Sit, please." I moved across the room, feeling the weight of his gaze. A medical assessment, perhaps, or something more personal. I sat facing him, noticing the oxygen tank discreetly positioned beside his chair, the pill bottles arranged in neat rows on the side table. "Your mother called you," he said. Not a question. "No," I answered truthfully. "Lydia did." He nodded, a slight smile tightening his lips. "Always the mediator. Your sister." Silence stretched between us, filled with 8 years of unspoken words and unshared experiences. Through the window behind him, I could see the backyard oak tree where I had built a treehouse as a child, my first real effort to create a world apart from the one my father had designed. "I read your books," he said finally, the words so unexpected that I almost asked him to repeat them. "You read my books?" He nodded, gesturing to a shelf I hadn't noticed, where a complete collection of my Eliot series stood, spines clearly worn from opening. All of them. Multiple times, in fact. I struggled to process this information, this reality so at odds with the narrative I had carried for 8 years. I thought you disapproved, that you saw them as meaningless." My father looked down at his hands, those hands that had been so sure, so confident in the operating room but had never known how to hold a son who dreamed differently than he did. "I was wrong," he said simply, the words hanging in the air between us like some rare and precious thing. I waited for the qualification, the but that would inevitably follow, explaining how I could have done more, been more, achieved something greater. It didn't come. Instead, he reached for a book on the side table. Eliot and the Bridge Between Worlds, my most recent publication. He opened it to a page I knew well, where Eliot finally reconciles with his estranged father. "This elephant," my father said, his finger tracing the illustration. "He's you, isn't he? And this old elephant here, the stubborn one who cannot see beyond his own trunk, that's me." The directness of the question caught me off guard. For years, I had carefully deflected similar inquiries from journalists and readers, maintaining that Eliot was a creation separate from myself. But here, with the man who had shaped so much of who I was and who I had fought not to be, honesty seemed the only possible path. "Yes," I admitted. "At least, parts of us. The best parts of me, I hope. And not just the worst parts of you." He closed the book gently, hands trembling slightly more now. "Your mother has been reading them to the children at the hospital. Did you know that?" I shook my head, something tightening in my chest. "They have a program for the long-term pediatric patients,"